Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, you're Charles II of Spain, last of the Habsburg kings and final wheezing punchline of a bloodline that folded in on itself like spoiled custard. From your very first breath, your body is a cautionary tale. Your jaw doesn't close, your tongue doesn't fit, and your royal advisors are already squinting at your skull like it's a medical curiosity. You are not born to rule. You are born to remind everyone why cousins shouldn't marry. Before we pry too far into your decaying lineage, do me a favour. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing who's tuning in from around the world. And if you'd like early access to future stories, ad-free audio versions of these grim lullabies, or just want to support the show, you'll find the Patreon link in the description. But for now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. You were born a royal miracle, which is to say a medical disaster the court was too polite to describe accurately. Before you took your first wheezing breath, your fate was already sealed. Not by war nor prophecy, but by paperwork. Centuries of dynastic ambition had reduced your family tree to something more like a family wreath, an elegant, circular arrangement of the same names, same faces, and unfortunately, the same genes. The Habsburgs called it keeping the blood pure. Nature, ever the realist, called it chromosomal sabotage. Let's begin with Charles V, your great-great-grandfather, emperor of half of Europe and collector of territories, the way some men collect gout. He married his first cousin. His son, Philip II, married 4 times, including to his own niece. And this was not a scandal. It was considered strategic. Every Habsburg marriage was a delicate political maneuver, expertly crafted to forge alliances and secure borders, often at the expense of basic biology. By the time your father, Philip IV of Spain, reached adulthood, the eligible royal dating pool had become so shallow it was less a gene pool and more a stagnant puddle. Philip IV was not what one might call an eager father. He produced over 30 illegitimate children with various mistresses and exactly 1 legitimate son who survived infancy, your half-brother, Balthazar Charles. Unfortunately, Balthazar died before reaching the throne, leaving Spain heirless and increasingly panicked. Philip married again, this time to someone guaranteed to have the correct royal credentials and the wrong number of shared ancestors, his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was 15, he was 44. Together, they shared more DNA than most siblings and enough Catholic fervour to power an exorcism. You were conceived in what one must assume was an act of grim obligation and poor lighting. By that point, Philip had already begun to decay in both body and spirit. His ministers ran the court. His empire was unravelling. His jaw was sagging. Still he needed an heir, and Mariana dutifully delivered, though not quite as intended. You arrived on a damp October day in 1661, howling like a mule and shaped like a riddle. The court physicians, all velvet robes and superstition, hovered anxiously while your mother gripped her rosary and tried not to scream. The labour was difficult, protracted, and accompanied by what official reports called great distress. What they meant was that it took far too long, involved far too much bleeding, and ended in far too many worried glances. Your skull was misshapen, your limbs were weak, your tongue was visibly swollen, so large it protruded from your mouth like a fleshy flag of surrender. Your skin was blotchy and pale, your muscles soft and unresponsive, and your jaw, oh, your jaw was unmistakably Habsburg. The lower mandible jutted forward in a grotesque protrusion, already marking you as the crown prince of inbreeding. Your eyelids didn't close properly. Your suckling reflex was minimal. The midwives, trained to smile through horror, offered tight-lipped congratulations and quickly passed you off to the first available nurse. There was no celebration in Madrid that night. The bells did not ring with joy. The court did not erupt in cheers. Instead, there was a long silence, a quiet shuffle of robes, a careful exchange of glances between priests, physicians, and advisors. Your birth was technically a success, you were alive, but politically and physically, it was something closer to a catastrophe. Still, Spain could not afford to be choosy. You were male, and your heart was beating, albeit unevenly. That was enough to issue proclamations and stage portraits that made you look slightly less ghastly than the reality. Behind the scenes, panic set in. Within hours of your birth, doctors were whispering of deformities and deficiencies. The court theologians began to wonder if your condition was divine punishment for sins they hadn't quite identified. A rumour spread that Mariana had looked at a deformed beggar during her pregnancy, which, according to the science of the time, explained everything. Another theory held that a jealous noblewoman had cursed your cradle. No one dared speak the obvious truth, that the same blood ran through both of your parents twice, and that it had finally caught up with them in the form of you. As a newborn, you failed every test the human body is supposed to pass. You couldn't nurse without choking. Your limbs moved irregularly. You slept too much or not at all. You were prone to sudden fevers, inexplicable tremors, and prolonged silences that terrified your nurses into checking for breath. Your body was a battleground of symptoms and anomalies. Every minor infection became a crisis. Every cough required a priest. The royal nursery became less a place of joy and more a quiet ward of dread. Your father visited once, perhaps twice, and left looking grimmer than usual. He instructed the court painters to produce an image of you that emphasized your lineage rather than your features. Your lineage being, of course, the only part of you considered remotely regal. The resulting portrait was a masterclass in flattery. You were shown in fine robes, eyes half-lidded with mystery, rather than muscular fatigue, and your jaw subtly adjusted to suggest strength rather than structural failure. No one was fooled, but no one said a word. The official birth announcement painted a glowing portrait of royal triumph. Spain, it declared, had been blessed with a strong and healthy male heir, a prince destined to carry forward the divine legacy of the most Catholic monarchs. Pamphlets were printed, bells rang, fireworks were launched in cities that hadn't seen bread in weeks. The clergy led processions, nobles toasted your name, and somewhere in Madrid, a man with half a boot and no teeth muttered that maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning around. They weren't. The public image was theatre. Behind the palace walls, the mood was less celebratory and more surgical. You had been born alive, yes, but no one could agree for how long. The midwives had taken one look at your pale, drooping face, your tongue lolling uselessly from your mouth, and immediately crossed themselves. The royal physicians, who styled themselves as men of science but feared comets and sneezes, began consulting their grim notebooks. You wouldn't nurse, you couldn't latch. Every feeding attempt ended in panic. Your lips too weak to seal, your tongue too swollen to coordinate, your gag reflex entirely unpredictable. Mariana, your mother, insisted you were merely delicate, which is the word queens use when their children come out looking like they were assembled by committee. But the truth was undeniable. Your mouth never fully closed. Drool leaked constantly. A small towel was kept tucked into your collar at all times, replaced every hour by a flustered nurse whose entire job was mopping up royal saliva. Feeding became an ordeal of desperation. Wet nurses were rotated in and out, some claiming you were cursed, others simply too exhausted to keep trying. Eventually, you were fed through a soft spoon and tilted at an angle so steep it looked more like embalming than childcare. Digestion, once achieved, did not go smoothly. Your stomach rejected most inputs. You vomited frequently, forcefully, and with a consistency that concerned everyone except the theologians, who saw it as a form of spiritual cleansing. Your intestines did not keep pace with your age. your appetite, or basic expectations of functionality. You bloated, you cramped, you passed gas with an enthusiasm disproportionate to your size. Your diapers were the subject of constant discussion among your physicians, who catalogued each bowel movement with the precision of battlefield dispatches. Physically, you were underwhelming. Your limbs were soft and loose, your muscles undeveloped, your bones worryingly flexible. You didn't lift your head at the appropriate age. You didn't grasp fingers when prompted. Your head was too large. Hydrocephalic, they might have said, if the term had been fashionable. And your neck too weak to support it. You lolled like a half-filled wineskin. Attempts to sit you upright were met with a slow slump to one side, your eyes staring vacantly at nothing in particular. You smiled rarely, and when you did, it looked accidental. And yet, no expense was spared in keeping you alive. The royal nursery swelled into a miniature hospital-chapel hybrid. You had physicians, nurses, wet nurses, spiritual advisors, herbalists, and at least 2 monks who wandered the halls muttering prayers under their breath. Your cradle was positioned near relics of dubious authenticity, splinters from the true cross, vials of saintly tears, the toenail of some beatified martyr whose name had long been forgotten. Incense was burned regularly, less to honour the divine than to mask the growing stench of sickness and anxiety. The staff around you learned to speak in euphemisms. You weren't deformed, you were unique. You weren't delayed, you were contemplative. You weren't sick, you were spiritually sensitive. The court painters, those long-suffering public relations, men of the Baroque era, were instructed to capture your likeness in increasingly abstract ways. The first few attempts were gently corrected. Soften the jaw, round out the eyes, less tongue, more dignity. Eventually, they gave up and painted you as a cherub with a rosary. Even your cries were strange. Most babies wail. You mewled, high-pitched, stuttering noises that rose without rhythm or urgency, like a kettle trying to whistle through wet cloth. Nurses said it didn't sound human. One nun, after a particularly long night shift, claimed you spoke Latin in your sleep. The story spread quickly. A bishop was summoned. You were doused with holy water. Your crib was moved to a different wing of the palace, as if the demons might get confused and lose track of you. And still, you lived. Fragile, yes. Sickly, constantly. But alive. Your survival was considered miraculous by some and horrifying by others. Ministers began to worry. If you were going to die, it would be best if you did it early, before formal titles were issued, before treaties were signed in your name. But the weeks passed, then months. You began to babble, not coherently, and never at the right times, but enough to give the illusion of progress. You could sit up for brief intervals, if propped with pillows. You learned to recognize faces, though your gaze always drifted a little to the left, as if seeing something no one else could. The court took this as a sign. Spain had its heir. Portraits were commissioned again, this time with less editing. You were photographed in miniature armour, though you couldn't stand. A tiny sword was strapped to your side, which you immediately tried to chew. The Council of State, relieved to have something resembling stability, began drafting official proclamations. Titles were conferred. You were styled as Charles, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne, ruler in waiting of half the known world, assuming you could one day swallow food without assistance. By your second birthday, the palace had settled into a grim routine. No one expected you to walk, speak clearly, or develop normally, but the language around you changed. You were no longer weak. You were God's chosen. Any visible improvement, no matter how slight, was declared a divine sign. You smiled once during Mass, a miracle. You didn't vomit for 2 days, a breakthrough. You survived a minor fever, proof of royal strength. All around you, adults reinterpreted disaster as destiny, rebranding your dysfunction as virtue, because it was the only option left. Your mother clung to hope with a devotion that bordered on delusion. She prayed daily, consulted mystics, and ordered new relics by the dozen. Her rooms became shrines. She refused to hear any report that painted you in an unflattering light, dismissing concerned doctors as heretics and pessimists. Her love for you was fierce, desperate, and wildly misdirected. Rather than question the system that had produced you, she doubled down on the sanctity of your existence. You were the will of God, she insisted. You would be king, she promised. And so, inevitably, they declared it officially. You were named heir, not because you were strong, not because you were capable, but because there was no one else. Spain, like you, had run out of options. The decision was announced with great ceremony. Cannons fired, banners unfurled, courtiers wept with forced joy. The public, never told the truth, rejoiced. And within the palace, your staff resumed their silent, careful work of keeping your heart beating and your mouth reasonably dry. You sat in your gilded cradle, wide-eyed, tongue protruding, and utterly unaware of the weight history had just placed on your malformed spine. Your father, Philip IV, died in the autumn of 1665, after a long, sluggish decline that surprised no one and relieved many. He had outlived his usefulness, if not his dignity, and spent his final years signing decrees he barely understood and watching his empire unravel one mutinous province at a time. When he finally stopped breathing, the court did not mourn so much as exhale. Spain needed a new monarch, a new beginning, a symbol of hope. Instead, it had you. You were 4 years old. You could not walk properly. You could not speak without dribbling. You wore a velvet robe that dragged behind you, and a crown that sat too heavily on your oversized head. When the official announcement was made, Charles II is now King of Spain, it was met with cheers in the streets, and something closer to alarm behind palace doors. The nation had inherited a monarch who could not chew meat. But tradition is tradition, and succession does not care about practicalities. You were propped up on a dais for your first official appearance, your limbs carefully arranged like decorative vegetables on a silver tray. You blinked slowly. A courtier dabbed your chin with a handkerchief. Trumpets blared, choirs sang, and you flinched. Your mother, Mariana of Austria, stood beside you with a frozen smile and a look of haunted determination. She squeezed your hand as if willing you to appear sentient. You wobbled slightly and sneezed into your own sleeve. A priest declared it a sign of royal vitality. The Spanish court went through the motions of welcoming its new sovereign, though no one could quite meet each other's eyes. Everyone knew the truth. You were not a king. You were a body in a robe. The real question was not what you would rule, but who would rule in your name. And so began the feeding frenzy. Your mother was named regent, of course. It was expected. She had the bloodline, the title, and, most importantly, first access to your nursery. But bloodline alone doesn't stop a court full of starving nobles, and Spain had no shortage of those. Ministers, bishops, generals, and grandees began circling like vultures that had just noticed the carcass still had some meat on it. Everyone wanted influence. Everyone had a cousin or brother or bastard they wanted, appointed to something lucrative. You were the excuse. Your mother was the obstacle. Mariana tried to hold the reins, but her grip was weak. She was Austrian, foreign, female, and increasingly paranoid. She trusted no one, except a few loyal confessor priests and a coterie of Habsburg loyalists who were better at piety than politics. She filled the court with nuns, advisors from Vienna, and men who mistook blind loyalty for competence. The Council of State groaned under the weight of incompetence and nepotism. Petitions piled up, coins lost value, troops went unpaid, and you sat quietly in a corner, chewing the tassel of a cushion. At court meetings, you were often present, but rarely conscious of the proceedings, A special chair was constructed to keep you upright. You would nod slowly, your eyes unfocused, occasionally offering a soft grunt or gurgle. No one expected coherence. Your presence alone was meant to signal continuity, even as the empire began to slide toward entropy. Ministers would debate matters of state, rebellions, famine, bankrupt finances, while you stared at the ceiling and sucked absent-mindedly on your lower lip. The meetings always ended the same way, with someone whispering, "Long live the king," and everyone else pretending that was a meaningful statement. Your tutors were told to begin your education, though it's unclear whether they ever managed to teach you anything beyond how to hold a spoon without injury. You had trouble sitting still. Your attention wandered after seconds. Your vocabulary was limited to a few garbled phrases, none of which resembled useful governance. You confused basic nouns. You flinched at loud noises. You were occasionally affectionate, but more often vacant, drifting between naps and fits of inexplicable laughter. Sometimes you screamed without warning. The priests said it was a test from God. Meanwhile, the empire you had inherited was crumbling. In Naples, tax revolts erupted. In the Netherlands, foreign powers eyed your territories like wolves watching an injured deer. Portuguese rebels refused to acknowledge your rule and continued their push for independence. In the Americas, colonial administrators embezzled with abandon, safe in the knowledge that their sovereign wouldn't be reading the reports. Spain's armies, already stretched thin and poorly supplied, grew restless. No one could decide whether to be loyal to the regent, the church, the army, or the money. At the centre of it all, you blinked slowly and tried to remember how spoons worked. Within the palace, rival factions sprang up like mould in a damp cellar. On one side were the Austrian loyalists, your mother's allies clinging to power through sheer volume of rosaries. On the other were the Castilian nobles, furious at being sidelined by foreigners, whispering behind heavy tapestries and dreaming of coups. The clergy naturally played both sides. Bishops held private audiences with your mother in the morning and plotted against her by candlelight in the evening. Every shadow was a conspiracy, every favour a bribe, every courtier a traitor waiting for the right moment to pounce. Your mother, though desperate, was not stupid. She saw the cracks forming, but had no mortar strong enough to fill them. She tightened security around your chambers. She limited access to your person. She began appointing only the most devout, the most obedient, and the most useless men she could find to key positions. They prayed loudly. They blessed everything. They achieved nothing. Outside the palace, people began to murmur. The king, they said, was touched. Not in the divine sense, not in the poetic sense. Touched as in slow, simple, broken. Rumours reached the countryside, where peasants laughed grimly and said that at least a mad child would be no worse than the last few kings. Satirists wrote biting verses. Foreign diplomats sent back letters written in a tone of half pity, half panic. France, especially, watched with interest. A sickly monarch in Spain meant opportunity. The vultures were watching the horizon now too, but inside the palace no one said a word directly. To question your capacity was to question divine will. God, after all, had placed you on the throne, and if you couldn't speak or walk properly, or remember your own name, that was God's mystery to solve, not Spain's. So your courtiers bowed, your ministers plotted, and your mother prayed. And you, King Charles II of Spain, age 4, sovereign of a crumbling empire, sat on your throne with a string of drool hanging from your lip, watching the world unravel just slightly faster than your nervous system. Your formal education began not with a slate and a stylus, but with a council of nervous advisors arguing over whether you were even capable of learning. The court had already accepted that you would never be a warrior, a leader, or anything that required physical exertion beyond sitting upright. But a king, they reasoned, must at least appear educated. He must nod at the right moments. He must sign his name. He must recite enough Latin to give the illusion of divine favour. You couldn't walk up a staircase without help, but it was decided that Latin declensions would be your next battle. The tutors they brought in were the best that could be coerced into service. Scholars from Salamanca, Jesuits from the imperial court, men with beards and reputations who arrived clutching stacks of treatises and crucifixes in equal measure. Within weeks, they realised they were not teaching a student so much as caretaking a fragile organism in royal tights. You could not sit still. You forgot what you had just been told. Your handwriting resembled the scratchings of a pigeon with vertigo. You often stared past your teachers, mouth slightly open, eyes unfocused, as if trying to remember a dream you'd never had. Every lesson had to be delivered in a slow, repetitive rhythm, with frequent pauses to mop your chin or adjust your posture. Reading comprehension was a fiction. You could sometimes identify individual letters, but putting them together taxed you beyond endurance. History was simplified to a string of family names you were told to recognise. Charles V, Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV, each one more disappointing than the last. Your own name was there too, spoken with the brittle hope that you might one day add something other than a cautionary footnote to the royal lineage. Latin was a disaster. You could not pronounce it properly. Your jaw wouldn't cooperate. Your tongue got in the way. Sentences emerged garbled and wet. One tutor tried phonetics, another tried musical rhythm, a third tried rosary beads. None succeeded. Eventually, they simply taught you to mumble vaguely in the direction of sacred texts, hoping that no one would listen too closely. And no one did. They were too busy listening to your lungs wheeze and your joints pop when you stood. Sheltering became the court's primary strategy. If you could not learn to function like a king, perhaps you could be preserved like one. You were kept in a carefully regulated environment, shielded from stress, noise, exertion, and the general unpleasantness of existence. All strong emotions were considered dangerous. You were never scolded. No one raised their voice around you. The lighting was dimmed. The windows stayed closed. Even your toys were chosen for their calming properties. Smooth, soft, pastel-coloured objects that could not startle, scratch, or bruise. You were not raised like a boy. You were maintained like a rare and irreplaceable vase. Questions were avoided. You were not asked to explain your actions, because there were rarely actions to explain. You were not encouraged to wonder, doubt, or dream. The closest you came to curiosity was asking repeatedly if your father had liked horses. The question came out, half-chewed and barely intelligible, but it was enough to trigger a week-long crisis among your handlers. They brought you paintings of horses. They brought you books with pictures. They showed you your father's saddle. You seemed unimpressed and never asked about horses again. Your health remained an endless source of terror. Every minor cough was treated like an omen. When you sneezed, a priest was summoned. When you fell asleep too suddenly, relics were pressed against your forehead. Your mother kept a rotating collection of holy artifacts near your chambers. Wood from the true cross, hair from obscure saints, water from springs that supposedly healed lepers. They were draped around your bed, like a protective fence, guarding you from invisible threats that were somehow less frightening than your very visible body. If you had a fever, the palace fell into ritual. Processions of monks marched in circles, chanting. Incense was burned until your chamber smelled like a tomb. Your sheets were changed hourly. You were bathed in blessed oil. If the fever broke, credit went to God. If it didn't, blame fell on your staff, who were quietly dismissed and replaced with others more willing to speak softly and carry smaller crosses. Despite the endless prayers, your body never improved. You remained frail. Your legs bent awkwardly when you stood. You tired quickly. You stumbled without warning. You complained of aches you couldn't name and fatigue you couldn't explain. You had no stamina, no coordination, no resilience. The physicians disagreed on your diagnosis, but agreed on the outcome. You would never be healthy. You were a container for symptoms, not a boy. And while all of this was happening, while you learned nothing and forgot everything, Spain continued its long slide into ruin. The court didn't mention it, around you of course. They didn't want to upset you. But the empire you were supposed to inherit was fraying at every edge. In the Netherlands, the Dutch continued to push back against Spanish rule, undermining the last scraps of imperial authority. In the Americas, silver shipments declined, corruption flourished, and the colonial bureaucracy collapsed under its own weight. Portuguese independence, long resisted, became a permanent fact. At home, peasants starved, nobles grumbled, and the economy trembled like a sick dog. You noticed none of it. You sat in your gilded chair, absorbing nothing, while ministers debated whether to raise taxes or default on yet another round of loans. You wandered palace corridors with a blank expression, while diplomats drafted letters explaining your quiet strength and mystical composure. The fiction held because it had to. No one could afford to admit the obvious. The empire's future was resting on the shoulders of a boy who couldn't spell his own name. By the time you reached adolescence, whatever potential had once been whispered about had thoroughly expired. You were not a late bloomer. You were not a misunderstood genius. You were a physically stunted, emotionally fragile, barely literate royal with a jaw that could barely close and a brain that refused to retain basic information. Your paranoia began to bloom around this time. Not the grand, conspiratorial kind that inspires revolutions, but the small, persistent kind that comes from being surrounded by whispers you can't interpret. You began to flinch when people spoke too loudly. You stared at servants with quiet suspicion. You asked repeatedly if people were stealing from you, though you could never say what. You grew anxious around unfamiliar faces. When someone mentioned your father, you often looked over your shoulder, as if expecting him to emerge from the wall. You distrusted your food. You distrusted your bed. You distrusted your own body, which betrayed you daily with tremors and aches and stumbles. Your mother insisted that you were simply sensitive. Your tutors said you were contemplative. Your physicians remained quiet and then quietly left. And so you drifted through your youth like a ship with no rudder, no sail, and no captain, kept afloat only by ritual, routine, and the terrified hope of a court that had long since stopped believing its own lies. By the time you officially came of age, you had not grown so much as been padded. The velvet robes got longer, the wigs got heavier, the titles stacked up like cushions beneath a collapsing chair. You were, in the eyes of the court and the Catholic world, now a man, though you weighed scarcely more than a servant girl and required assistance to stand for prolonged ceremonies. But law and tradition cared little for musculature or mental clarity. You were now expected to rule, or at the very least, to sit upright while others ruled through your slack-jawed silence. With adulthood came ceremony, responsibility, and an aggressive escalation in medical interventions. Childhood had been soft-spoken, holy relics and hopeful prayers. Adulthood, however, required action. Your physicians, emboldened by your age and desperate to fix what had never worked to begin with, began a new phase of treatment. You were no longer a delicate child to be protected. You were a sovereign vessel to be drained, scraped, blistered, and purged until something resembling vitality could be coaxed out of your decaying frame. First came the leeches. They were applied behind your ears, under your jaw, on your inner thighs, your temples, and sometimes, when the court physician was feeling creative, to your gums. The idea was simple and stupid. Too much blood made the body sluggish, melancholic, and impure, so they removed it, slowly, repeatedly, You sat in a high-backed chair, wrapped in embroidered towels, while black worms siphoned your strength in the name of balance. You didn't protest. You rarely had the energy. When the leeches finished, you were dizzy, pallid, and often too weak to lift your head. This was considered a sign of improvement. Then came the purgatives, vomit-inducing tonics that smelled like old vinegar and tasted worse. These were forced upon you in elegant porcelain cups, sometimes with honey stirred in to trick your senses. They worked quickly, too quickly. You would retch over silver basins as a circle of physicians nodded gravely, charting your output as if your bile held the secrets of kingship. Once you collapsed mid-retch and struck your head on the rim of a bowl. The resulting bruise lasted a week. No one mentioned it in the reports. When the vomiting failed to stir divine favour, they turned to burning. Cautery was a respectable treatment among the elite, which is to say they believed it separated illness from the body through the ancient magic of setting parts of you on fire. Heated metal rods were applied to the soles of your feet, your spine, and your shoulders. Sometimes you screamed, sometimes you didn't. Eventually, you simply twitched and trembled while the smell of scorched skin drifted through your chambers, like incense. Your mother prayed harder after those sessions. The physicians prayed too, though often for their continued employment. Your condition baffled and infuriated them. One moment you could sit up and blink slowly through a state council. The next you were vomiting into your own lap, or shaking uncontrollably during mass. The seizures began around this time, mild at first, then more frequent, more violent, more humiliating. Your limbs would spasm, your jaw would clamp shut, your eyes would roll. Ministers looked away. Servants pretended not to notice. Your mother wept. The doctors increased your treatments. They introduced blessed wax, melted down from candles that had supposedly touched saints. This wax was poured onto your chest, your hands, your feet, and once, disastrously, near your inner thigh. The burns lingered. The saintly healing did not. You were also encouraged to drink waters infused with sacred texts, ink steeped in holy water, until the page dissolved into a grey, pulpy broth that you sipped from a gold chalice. You gagged naturally and expelled most of it onto your lap. This too was seen as encouraging. You were rejecting sin, one page at a time. The court invented rituals around your suffering. Each episode had its own prescribed response. A seizure during prayer meant a fast must be declared across Madrid. A fever meant relics must be borrowed from neighbouring cathedrals. A nosebleed meant a day of silence, followed by a full ceremonial bleeding to equalise the humours. It was a medical pageant, elaborate, absurd, and entirely ineffective. And yet every time you twitched, the cycle repeated. Your body never adjusted to these treatments. It rebelled. You began to waste away. Your limbs, always thin, grew gaunt and skeletal. Your skin yellowed. You slept more than you were awake. Your digestion, never robust, began to fail completely. Chronic diarrhea set in, accompanied by cramping so intense, you often wept without sound. You couldn't keep weight on. You couldn't keep food down. You couldn't tell if you were hungry or nauseated. Some days you refused to eat at all. Not that eating helped. Your jaw, misaligned since birth and never corrected, had grown worse with age. The famous Habsburg chin had matured into a structural liability. Your lower mandible jutted like a misplaced plank, and your upper teeth failed to meet it. Chewing was more theory than practice. You dribbled constantly. Solid food was unthinkable. Your meals consisted almost entirely of thin broths, overcooked vegetables, mashed bread soaked in milk, and the occasional custard designed to mask medicinal powders. These were fed to you slowly, like offerings to a fragile altar. You choked often. Sometimes the food went down the wrong way. Other times your throat simply refused to cooperate. You would splutter, cough, wheeze, and turn a slow, bruised shade of purple while your attendant stood by with towels and prayers. Once you coughed up a small piece of carrot with such violence that it struck the physician in the chest. He took it as a sign of progress. He increased the size of the vegetable fragments the following week. You vomited them back within the hour. The worst part, perhaps, was that none of this ever worked. There were no real improvements. The seizures continued. The vomiting persisted. The tremors in your legs grew more pronounced. You had trouble standing without swaying. Your vision blurred unpredictably. You would lose sensation in your fingers. Your hearing faltered. Your memory deteriorated. Your attention span, never impressive, began to vanish altogether. Some days you could not remember who had spoken to you that morning. Some days you weren't sure what year it was. You often forgot your own birthday, but no one corrected you. They just nodded and said, "God bless him," and passed you another tonic. Your mother grew increasingly desperate. She cycled through doctors like rosaries. Spanish physicians gave way to Austrians, then Italians, then Germans. Each promised a cure, each failed. One recommended suspending you upside down. Another suggested bloodletting through the soles of the feet. One insisted on burying a pigeon beneath your pillow to absorb your illness. You slept atop several pigeons that month. They didn't help either. You endured it all in silence, or rather, in the low, wet moans that had become your form of protest. You were too weak to argue, too tired to resist. You submitted to the burns, the cuts, the choking wax, and the bile-stained broth because resistance required energy, and you had none to spare. You were not healing. You were surviving, barely, and no one knew what else to do with you. The court continued to present you as a functioning monarch. Portraits showed you dressed in armour you couldn't lift, holding swords you couldn't swing, staring ahead with eyes that barely focused. They depicted a strength that did not exist and a stability that could not be found. Your body was failing. Your mind was slipping. But Spain needed a king, and you, poor Charles, were what it had left. When physicians ran out of leeches, purges, prayers, and plausible explanations for your condition, they turned, inevitably, to the spiritual. It began with whispers, as these things always do, whispers that echoed behind tapestries, in the cloisters of the palace chapel, in the corners of courtier conversations where the air smelled faintly of incense and fear. You weren't just sick, they murmured. You weren't just malformed, cursed by bad blood and worse medicine. No, this went deeper. This was unnatural. This was evil. Perhaps the devil had crawled into your royal skull and made himself at home. It didn't take much to convince anyone. You twitched, you drooled, you spoke in strange syllables that didn't resemble Spanish, Latin, or sense. You stared at walls for hours. You shrieked in your sleep. You had fevers with no visible cause, and you vomited during Mass. Sometimes you couldn't recognize your own reflection. Once you tried to bless a chamber pot. The line between disease and possession was thin in 17th century Spain, and you crossed it daily just by existing. The Inquisition had waned in formal power, but the priests never left. They were still there, robed and ready, eager to find signs of spiritual corruption in anything that moved, or twitched, or cried out during meals. You were a tempting target, a king who couldn't rule, couldn't speak, couldn't produce an heir, and couldn't walk across a room without assistance. Clearly, something infernal was at work. Clearly, this was not just bad luck or genetics. Clearly, someone had opened a door and let the devil through. And so, your illnesses became hauntings. Your seizures were no longer medical events. They were spiritual attacks. Your hallucinations became demonic visitations. Your endless vomiting was interpreted as the body rejecting unclean spirits. A new set of men arrived to help. Bishops, monks, exorcists, relic vendors, all with the same confident solemnity of those who know they'll be paid whether or not the patient survives. The rituals began modestly, a little holy water sprinkled during your morning prayers, a relic of Saint Bernardino placed under your pillow, a crucifix tucked into the folds of your mattress. You were told to wear a small medallion bearing the image of Saint Vitus, patron saint of epilepsy and lost causes. You chewed it. That only seemed to confirm the diagnosis. When the subtle measures failed, they escalated. You were blessed daily. You were touched with burning incense. Your food was consecrated. The air in your chamber was so thick with smoke and mumbling that one courtier fainted just stepping inside. The priest began chanting over you as you slept. Sometimes they slapped your forehead mid-prayer to startle the spirits. You barely reacted. Sometimes you twitched in your sleep, and they took it as confirmation that Satan had been disturbed. Your mother was, by now, fully convinced. The court physicians had failed. Your tutors had failed. Your body had failed. Only the church remained, and the church promised that what had been taken by demons could be returned by God. She prayed louder. She ordered more relics. She sent envoys to Rome to petition for special indulgences. The first formal exorcism was held in your bedchamber. The Bishop of Toledo led the proceedings, flanked by a dozen monks with shaved heads and wide eyes. You were strapped to a chair. You did not struggle. You had no energy to resist. They doused you with holy water until your clothes were soaked and your hair stuck to your forehead. They shouted prayers. They invoked saints. They waved incense burners like weapons. You sat there, mouth agape, blinking slowly until something shifted inside you. Your body tensed. Your fingers curled. Your eyes rolled. You let out a low groan and began foaming at the mouth. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was sickly, slow, and miserable. Bubbles of spittle collecting on your lower lip and dripping down your chin. One bishop fainted. Another began speaking in tongues, or possibly just having a nervous breakdown. Your mother burst into sobs. The monks redoubled their efforts. You twitched, seized, then collapsed forward, drooling onto your own lap. Everyone clapped. They believed it had worked. Of course it hadn't. You woke up the next morning confused, trembling, and leaking fluid from 3 different orifices. But no one acknowledged this. They had seen the devil leave your body, and they would not be contradicted. The success was proclaimed across the kingdom. A miracle had occurred. God had reached down into your foul Habsburg flesh and pulled out a demon by its ankles. The church declared victory. You, for your part, vomited during breakfast and wet yourself during Mass. It was only the first of many such victories. You were exorcised again a month later, this time in the cathedral itself. Then again during Lent. Then again after a particularly long stretch of insomnia during which you were seen speaking softly to a crucifix and then trying to bite it. Each time the ritual grew more elaborate. More priests, more candles, more onlookers who came not to pray but to witness what you had become. A royal spectacle, equal parts tragedy and theatre. You were a king possessed, not by demons perhaps, but by the accumulated weight of centuries of inbreeding, of ritual, of power so diluted it curdled. You had become a living symbol of divine punishment, a holy mystery no one wanted to solve too quickly, lest it cost them their influence. The court clung to the belief that God still had a plan for you, because the alternative, that you were simply broken beyond repair, was too monstrous to accept. And so they purified, they shouted, they blessed, they wept, they fasted on your behalf, they shook relics in your face and declared you cleansed, and through it all, you sat slumped in your throne, damp with holy water and sweat, eyes dull, stomach cramping, bowels shifting, with the slow inevitability of royal decline. When they told you you were to be married, you were 17 years old and already collapsing. Your jaw still refused to close. Your speech was slurred and wet. You required help dressing, standing, chewing, and occasionally remembering which direction was forward. But Spain needed an heir, And since science had long since given up on improving your body, diplomacy stepped in. You didn't need to be well, you just needed to be wed. And so a marriage was arranged, because nothing says hope quite like tying a broken empire to a boy who can't hold a fork. Her name was Marie Louise of Orléans. She was also 17, a French Bourbon princess with fine teeth, delicate hands, and a face that could have belonged to any number of fragile saints. She was chosen not for her wit or her charm, or her preferences, those weren't consulted, but because she was Catholic, well-connected, and theoretically fertile. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, offered her as a gesture of good faith and quiet strategy. Spain accepted her like a package marked breakable, urgent. She was told you were devout, shy, and perhaps a little delicate. She was not told that you choked on your own saliva in public and often forgot where you were mid-conversation. You met for the first time in 1679, just after your marriage by proxy. You were dressed in layers of velvet, so thick they kept your spine from folding. She arrived in Madrid to cheering crowds and thick incense, already unnerved by the gravity of her role and the hollowness of the palace. You greeted her with a slow, limp kiss on the cheek. She tried not to react. The smell of sickness lingered faintly on your skin, something between spoiled milk and overused incense. Still she curtsied. Still she smiled. Still she hoped. The wedding was a spectacle, all gold embroidery and hollow cheer. You were crowned with roses and promises you couldn't pronounce. Priests chanted. Nobles feigned enthusiasm. The painters positioned you carefully so that your deformities were less visible. Behind closed doors, the whispers had already begun. Would the marriage be consummated? Could it be? You had been briefed, of course, but nothing stuck. You only knew that everyone expected something, and that something involved lying down next to your wife and trying not to drool on her. The wedding night was a disaster cloaked in linen and prayer. You were nervous. She was terrified. Your attendant stood outside the door, listening. Inside, Marie Louise tried to hold your hand, and you flinched. You undressed clumsily, if at all. Your body didn't respond. Not emotionally, not physically. You were tired. You were cold. You wanted broth. She waited in silence while you muttered a half-remembered Latin blessing, and then fell asleep with one leg hanging off the bed. No one said anything the next morning, but the sheets were dry, and the rumours took root. You didn't understand what the problem was. You had done what you were told. You had shown up. You had laid down. You had survived. What more could anyone want? Marie Louise, meanwhile, was humiliated and afraid. The Queen of Spain was supposed to produce an heir. That was her job, her title, her national function. And she had been given a husband who couldn't keep his tongue inside his mouth, let alone do anything with the rest of his anatomy. The palace was a cage, and she was now locked inside with something that resembled a king only in clothing and title. Attempts were made. You were fed herbal tonics meant to improve virility. You were blessed with relics, splashed with holy water, prayed over by bishops. Doctors gave you stimulants and dietary suggestions. Your confessor told you to relax and open yourself to duty. No one explained what that meant. Marie Louise, coached by older women, tried to encourage you. She lit candles, she wore soft perfumes, she waited, but you didn't respond, you didn't notice. You often forgot you were supposed to be trying at all. And so the court began watching the marriage bed, quite literally. Servants checked the sheets, ladies in waiting whispered about the Queen's complexion, ministers charted the Queen's menstrual cycles and reported their findings with the gravity of wartime intelligence. Every morning, the condition of the linens was noted. The absence of stains became a political crisis. Bishops held discreet fasts. Doctors muttered about humoral imbalances. You asked why everyone looked tense at breakfast. No one answered. Marie Louise bore it quietly. for a while. She smiled in public. She sang during services. She fed birds in the courtyard like a woman from a painting. But her cheer faded. Her appetite withered. She began to lose weight. Her cheeks hollowed. Her eyes grew shadowed. The ladies around her began using the word melancholy in hushed voices. What they meant was that she was unravelling. Her husband was a walking catastrophe, and she was expected to turn that into a child. You, of course, were deteriorating as well. The stress of expectation, what little of it you understood, made your tremors worse. Your speech became more jumbled. You vomited after meals. You were bled more frequently to restore balance, which only made you weaker. You stopped attending court sessions altogether, except for the ones where you were paraded like a ceremonial relic. You sat silently beside Marie Louise during feast days, your face slack, your head wobbling slightly as she blinked away tears beside you. Still the pressure continued. The kingdom demanded an heir, and so the blame shifted to her. Maybe she was barren, maybe she was cursed, maybe she had failed to inspire the king's body with her womanly charm. No one said it openly, but it was there in every glance. The ministers began to eye annulment procedures. Quiet letters were sent to Vienna and Rome, inquiring about fertility rites, alternative matches, replacement brides. Marie Louise, who had tried so hard, who had prayed so much, began to shut down. In the final years of her life, she rarely spoke above a whisper. She fainted often. She stopped eating entirely for stretches. The doctors declared nervous imbalance and prescribed tonics made of crushed pearls and opium. She became translucent, drifting through the palace like a mourning ghost. She clutched her rosary tighter each day. You asked once why she didn't smile anymore. She didn't answer. She died in February of 1689, just shy of her 27th birthday. The official cause was intestinal obstruction. The unofficial cause was misery. Her stomach had twisted in on itself, likely from years of starvation and stress, and she died in agony. You were told, you wept, or maybe you didn't. Accounts vary. You may have been asleep. You may have nodded politely and asked what was for lunch. Spain declared a week of mourning. Bells tolled, masses were said, ministers scrambled, because once again the Queen had failed to produce an heir, and once again the last Habsburg king of Spain was alone, drooling, deteriorating, and now publicly widowed. The Habsburg line dangled on your name like a fraying thread, and everyone knew it. One wife had failed. Perhaps the next one would succeed, or at least last long enough to squeeze out a miracle. The Austrians were eager to try. France had already taken its shot and failed spectacularly. Now it was the Holy Roman Empire's turn. The candidate was quickly chosen, Marie Anna of Neuburg, daughter of the Elector Palatine. She came from a famously fertile family. Her sisters were noted for producing armies of children, sometimes in batches. This was her greatest qualification. Not wit, not charm, not youth, fertility. Her womb was practically notarized before she left Vienna. Spain wasn't looking for a queen. It was looking for an incubator. Marie Anna knew exactly what she was walking into. She'd heard the rumours. Everyone had. She knew about your face, your jaw, your limp, your seizures, your fainting spells, your fertility, or lack thereof. She also knew her assignment. She was to arrive in Madrid, marry a drooling man with no coordination, and solve 2 decades of dynastic failure with sheer willpower and the blessings of half the Catholic Church. She was not a romantic. She was a strategist. She boarded the carriage like a general, heading to the front lines. You met her in 1690. You were 28, though you looked older, and moved like someone much closer to death than to fatherhood. She was 23, dressed in silk and determination. You blinked at her. She curtsied. Your attendants prompted you to smile. You did briefly, revealing teeth that never quite matched. She took your hand and held it for 3 seconds longer than necessary. She was already making assessments. The wedding was sombre, less pageantry, more logistics. Spain had already exhausted its enthusiasm for royal marriages that went nowhere. The people cheered politely. The clergy prayed loudly. The ministers waited silently. You stood stiffly beside your new bride, face expressionless, eyes blinking at different intervals. Marie Anna didn't flinch. She had already committed. This was her battlefield now. Her first move was immediate. Control the bedroom. The consummation was an urgent matter of state. She approached it like a Catholic ritual, crossed with military choreography. The bed was blessed. Relics were placed nearby. She wore a crucifix and drank 3 fertility tonics beforehand. You arrived late and confused. She offered a prayer and a polite suggestion. You stared blankly. She tried again. You apologized and asked if the candles were too bright. Then you passed out. The next morning, the linens were inspected. They revealed nothing but awkward creases and a faint smell of herbs. The whispers resumed. The court recorded another failed night. Marie Anna noted the results with an unreadable expression and requested that Mass be said twice that day. The servants changed the sheets. You were informed of none of it. What followed was a campaign. Marie Anna organised a series of rituals, schedules, and natural encouragements. You were placed on a strict diet of warm broths, restorative wines, and seasonal fruits, soaked in cinnamon and faith. You were taken on early morning walks through the garden, even when your legs trembled. You were instructed to avoid stressful activity, loud noises, or impure thoughts, though no one could confirm if you were capable of having any thoughts at all. Each night, new rituals, a different set of saintly relics, a different prayer. Sometimes she sang hymns, sometimes she read from the Psalms, sometimes she simply sighed and asked you, very gently, to try. You smiled. You said she looked lovely. You then fell asleep mid-sentence. The church declared your effort commendable. Marie Anna did not. The physicians returned. You were examined, gently, thoroughly, apologetically. Their reports were vague but damning. One described your reproductive organs as present but not animated. Another called them structurally inert. A third, in a fit of honesty, said they resembled wax fruit left too close to a fire. No one used the word impotent, not officially, but it hung in the air like a bad hymn. Marie Anna pressed on. For the first year, she truly tried. She held your hand in public. She smiled during meals. She led joint prayers. She made sure the court saw a queen invested in her husband's well-being, but she was no fool. After months of ritual and rehearsal and medical humiliation, the truth became undeniable. You were not a man who could father a child. You were barely a man at all. She had married a ghost in a brocade coat, and now she was expected to pretend he ruled the country. So she pivoted. If she couldn't be mother to an heir, she would be mother to power. She carved out a faction of her own, Austrian sympathisers, pro-Habsburg clergymen, and a handful of ambitious nobles who saw which way the wind was blowing. She built alliances. She wrote letters. She took confession with people who could carry her suggestions upward. She began referring to Spain as my adopted homeland, and made it very clear that she would not let it fall into French hands. You noticed none of this. You spent your days in partial silence, your hands shaking too badly to write, your jaw locked in that permanent, aching angle. You still participated in ceremonies, though increasingly you were wheeled to them. You still nodded at diplomats, though you rarely understood what they were saying. You still smiled at Marie Anna in the mornings, when you remembered who she was. To the court, the Queen had become your handler. Your public appearances were arranged by her schedule. Your statements were filtered through her voice. If you sneezed, she explained it. If you twitched, she blessed it. If you slurred your words, she translated them into policy. Ministers began to approach her before they approached you. Priests consulted her about your spiritual well-being. She became the intermediary between your failing body and the machinery of empire. Behind closed doors, the relationship turned glacial. Marie Anna no longer tried to touch you. She no longer lit candles. She no longer sang. She slept in her own quarters and let the court assume whatever comforted them. Her prayers, once hopeful, became pointed. She prayed for guidance. She prayed for strength. She prayed for Spain. She did not pray for you. You, for your part, seemed vaguely relieved. The pressure was gone. No one asked you to perform anymore. You spent your evenings dozing beside the fire, your hands curled into your lap, your eyes blinking at nothing in particular. You were not a husband. You were not a ruler. You were not, in any practical sense, present. But you were still the king. And that was enough, for now. By the time you entered your 30s, Europe had already begun preparing for your funeral. Not ceremonially, of course. There was no casket draped in velvet, no mourning procession rehearsals, no official obituaries, just a quiet, coordinated sense that your death was inevitable, imminent, and deeply convenient. You had outlived both your first wife and your usefulness. The war planners were circling, the diplomats were drafting, the monarchs were sharpening their inheritance knives, and still you breathed, barely. Your body, once frail, had begun to unravel in earnest. You couldn't stand without swaying. You couldn't walk without help. Your hands trembled constantly, as if trying to shake loose whatever dignity still clung to your fingers. Your skin yellowed and sagged. Your hair thinned and clumped. Your teeth, those few brave soldiers that remained, shifted unpredictably in your gums. Your eyes had grown glassy, prone to staring too long at chandeliers or door hinges. You had begun to forget names, then faces, then whole people, until even your reflection in the polished silver became a stranger. Your voice degraded too. Once soft and slow, it became a slurry of wet consonants and half-finished sentences. Words escaped you. Syntax abandoned you. You often began to speak, and then forgot what you'd meant to say halfway through the first syllable. When you did complete a thought, it was usually circular, contradictory, or baffling. The moon has blood in it, you reportedly told a visiting bishop during a state dinner. No one knew what you meant. The bishop nodded and declared the king was wise beyond his years. The court adjusted, as it always had. Ministers stopped briefing you entirely and began simply informing you of what you'd already decided. Documents were placed before you with your signature pre-scrawled in pencil beneath them, so you could trace it with minimal effort. Occasionally, someone would hold your hand and guide it across the page like a child learning to write his name. Royal decrees, military orders, trade treaties, none of them bore your thought, only your increasingly illegible mark. You were still technically the king. The ink just wasn't yours. Even the rituals of kingship were repurposed around your decay. You no longer rode through the streets during festivals. You were wheeled, sometimes in a carriage, sometimes in a high-backed chair, with silk draped across your lap and a perfumed cloth pressed to your chin to catch the drool. You blinked slowly at the crowds. You raised your hand in vague approximations of a wave. The people cheered dutifully. Children were told they were lucky to see their sovereign in person. You heard none of it. Your ears had begun to fail, and besides, you rarely knew where you were anyway. The Spanish economy, once sluggish, had officially collapsed into parody. Silver shipments from the New World had dwindled to a trickle. Corruption flourished. Tax collectors stopped bothering with books and started using threats. Bread prices doubled, then tripled. Grain riots broke out. People were burned as witches for possessing flour. The crown defaulted on its debts for the umpteenth time, but no one was shocked. You owed everyone, and no one expected payment. The only stable currency left in Spain was prayer, and even that was losing value. The military was no better. Once a feared imperial force, it had become a disorganized collection of underpaid, underfed, and underwhelming men who fought more among themselves than with the enemy. Veterans sold their uniforms to buy boots. Muskets were pawned. Horses starved in their stables. Generals staged elaborate parades to distract from the fact that their troops had no ammunition. Warships rotted in harbours. Galleons were used for storing grain. You were still referred to as commander of the armies, though you hadn't walked across a room unaided in 5 years. Your ministers did what they could, which wasn't much. The few competent men still left in Madrid spent their days arguing over how to spin collapse into continuity. They issued proclamations about divine testing, historical cycles, national character. They blamed the weather. They blamed the Dutch. They blamed the Jews. They blamed the French, the Protestants, the devil. And finally, when they ran out of scapegoats, the peasants themselves. You were never blamed. You were above blame. You were too sick, too holy, too absent to be held responsible. Foreign ambassadors, of course, knew better. They reported your condition back to their courts with grim fascination. The English envoy described you as more corpse than king. The Dutch called you a shadow in velvet. The French, with their usual flair for cruelty, referred to you as the walking obituary. One Venetian diplomat wrote that you smelled like decay and sanctity in equal measure. They all agreed on one point. You would not last the year. They had been saying that since 1690. And still you lived. That was the most inconvenient thing about you. Not your incompetence, not your infertility, not your near-total mental collapse, but your stubborn, wheezing refusal to die. Europe was waiting. The War of Spanish Succession was practically already scripted, but you wouldn't oblige. You kept breathing, you kept eating your soft bread and sipping your holy wine and blinking at the ceiling like you were waiting for something to happen. You were the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, and you were dragging the end of the dynasty out like a man stalling at his own execution. Marie Anna, now more regent than wife, managed what little was left of you. She dressed you, she fed you, she controlled who saw you and when. She offered carefully edited updates to the court. The king is resting. The king is in prayer. The king is meditating upon divine mysteries. No one believed it. Everyone went along with it. Better a dying king than no king at all. Inside the palace, your days blurred. You woke late, if you woke at all. You were bathed by silent men in white gloves. You were dressed in gold and lace, though your skin itched under the weight. Meals were served in courses you couldn't taste. You nodded at visitors you didn't recognize. You whispered confessions no one could decipher. You stared at the fire as if it might explain something. Your body remained in motion, barely, but your mind had wandered somewhere beyond the reach of Spain. And still, no air, still, no escape, still, no end. You had become a relic, carried from chapel to chamber, bowed to but not consulted, loved by no one and feared by nothing. You were history in real time. A man-shaped warning, a breathing curse, a monarch in the medical sense only. The King of Spain was alive, and it was the worst possible news. By your mid-30s, though the number was more ceremonial than biological, there was only one topic anyone in the palace cared about. Who would succeed you? You were clearly not going to produce an heir. That particular avenue had been closed for years, sealed off by faulty anatomy, failed rituals, and the collective trauma of your 2 wives. Your body was failing. Your mind was adrift. The line of Spanish Habsburgs had withered down to you and your increasingly unhinged bedtime prayers. And the rest of Europe was watching, teeth bared, waiting for you to finally stop breathing so they could divide the corpse of your empire like a roast duck. The problem was not that Spain had no claimant. The problem was that Spain had too many, each backed by armies, treaties, and an aggressive understanding of divine right. France had its candidate, Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Young, Bourbon and enthusiastic, he was the most direct descendant through your half-sister, Maria Theresa, who had renounced her claim when she married into France, though predictably, the French argued that this was more of a suggestion than a binding legal fact. Austria, of course, had its own proposal. Archduke Charles, younger son of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, your blood relative through the ever-twisting Habsburg maze. He was seen by many, especially in Madrid's conservative circles, as the safer choice, more familiar, more Catholic, more inbred perhaps, but at least he came pre-packaged with the correct last name and a chin that wouldn't shock the courtiers. The Austrians claimed it was the only way to keep the Habsburg legacy intact. The French claimed it was a trap. The Pope, naturally, pretended to be neutral. He issued vague statements about the dignity of the Spanish people, the sanctity of bloodlines, and the importance of peace, while quietly nodding in private meetings with whichever ambassador brought the nicest wine. The rest of Europe picked sides. England leaned toward Austria. The Dutch worried about balance. The Italians shrugged. The Portuguese just hoped they wouldn't be invaded again. And in the middle of this great geopolitical chessboard sat you, drooling, shaking, whispering to crucifixes, and holding the last royal signature anyone still needed. You were no longer a ruler. You were a seal on a powder keg. Whichever name you endorsed would become the new heir to the Spanish Empire. Whichever direction your limp, ink-stained hand pointed would trigger war, alliances, revolts, and a whole new century of bleeding. So the lobbying began. Ambassadors hovered like flies around your bedside. Gifts were brought, prayers were said. Doctors arrived with tonics meant to stimulate lucidity, which tasted suspiciously like expensive alcohol. French envoys presented portraits of young Philip, all curly hair and manufactured virtue, with gentle suggestions that he was strong, healthy, and wouldn't need to be exercised before breakfast. Austrian representatives countered with family trees, thick with Habsburgs, and tangled lines of legitimacy, implying that anyone without your jawline was a foreign usurper. Each side insisted that you were capable of making a wise and independent decision. This was, of course, theatre. You had not made an independent decision in years. You spent most of your time in bed, clutching rosaries, muttering at shadows, and occasionally trying to bless inanimate objects. Ministers arranged your meals based on the day's liturgical calendar. You mistook your chamberlain for Saint Sebastian twice in the same week. One advisor claimed you conversed with ghosts. Another said you had developed a habit of speaking to chairs as if they were councilmen. No one could prove otherwise. You were shown documents, you blinked, you were read letters, you nodded, you were handed pens, you dropped them. It often took several days to get your trembling fingers to sign anything, and when you did, the results resembled the scrawl of a man being dragged across gravel. But still, your signature carried weight. You were the king. As long as your heart beat, even faintly, you were the final word on succession. Marie Anna, now fully in charge of your daily existence, leaned heavily toward the Austrian claim. It made sense. She was Austrian. She was ambitious. She trusted her own blood more than French flattery. She encouraged you to consider the Archduke. She scheduled audiences with Austrian supporters. She asked leading questions in your rare moments of clarity. But clarity was not something you produced on command. You were a fog wrapped in a bathrobe, nodding at hallucinations and mistaking legal documents for menus. At night, you clutched relics and muttered about divine instruction. You asked for signs. You demanded masses be said in rooms you weren't in. You told your priest that Saint Isidore had spoken to you through a candle and advised you to eat more figs. When pressed about your preferences, you said that the crown should go to the one who shines the brightest. which no one could interpret with confidence. A few weeks later, you recanted and said the true heir was the boy with the strong shadow. Again, no clarification followed. Despite all this, a decision eventually had to be made. Spain was rotting, armies were waiting, the French were pushing harder, and the Austrians were preparing for war regardless. Your ministers gathered. They debated, argued, schemed. Eventually, someone placed a piece of parchment in front of you and said, "This one, Majesty. This is your will?" You blinked, you nodded. Your hand was guided to the paper. Your signature emerged, slow and misshapen, like a bruise forming in ink. You named Philip of Anjou as your heir. The French rejoiced. The Austrians snarled. The English narrowed their eyes. The Pope issued another non-committal blessing, and across Europe, war drums began to beat with restrained excitement. Everyone had known it was coming. They had just been waiting for you to finally drool your way into a choice. The War of the Spanish Succession didn't start the moment you signed, but it might as well have. The papers were sent. The treaties were re-read. The soldiers were drilled. England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria began forming what would become the Grand Alliance. France prepared its armies. Spain held its breath. And you, having changed the course of history, spent the next morning staring at a spoon for 15 minutes before asking if it was your uncle. By the final year of your life, your body had fully surrendered. There was no strength left to pretend. No ceremony could disguise the stench of deterioration that followed you through the palace like a second cloak. You no longer stood. You no longer sat upright without assistance. You were carried, propped, wheeled, or wrapped in blankets and tucked into corners like an antique no one dared throw out. You rarely opened your eyes for long, and when you did, they were bloodshot, clouded, and slow to track movement. The light hurt them. So did noise. So did breathing. You could not eat. Swallowing had become a violent gamble. Each bite, no matter how soft, threatened to send you into a coughing fit that ended with blood in your lap and a physician scrambling for a basin. Broths were ladled between your slack lips while you wheezed. Most of it dribbled back out. On good days, you could manage a spoonful or two of milk-thinned mush before your throat gave out. On bad days, you choked and turned purple, while someone gently smacked your back and muttered a prayer through clenched teeth. You could not walk. The muscles in your legs had wasted down to the bone. What little weight you had left hung unevenly on a twisted frame. Your knees buckled when you tried to stand. Your hips seized. Even lying still caused you pain. So you were kept in bed, surrounded by silks and relics, while the mattress beneath you sagged under the damp weight of your dying body. Bed sores bloomed like bruises. Your back blistered from pressure. Attendants rotated you every few hours, not out of comfort, but to prevent your flesh from fusing to the sheets. You screamed during thunderstorms. You screamed at bells, dogs, footsteps, breezes, and sometimes nothing at all. The pain came in waves, piercing headaches, spasms, stabbing cramps, burning in your joints. And when it hit, you wailed. It wasn't dignified, it wasn't controlled. It was the raw, wordless howling of a man whose nerves had gone haywire. Priests said it sounded like possession. Doctors said it was your brain liquefying. You didn't care. You just wanted it to stop. The clergy descended in shifts, not out of hope for recovery, but out of obligation. You were a king, and kings deserved to be prayed over until the last breath. They filled your chambers with incense and muttering. They brought relics, blessed oil, crucifixes, candles. Some believed you were dying. Some believed you were already dead and hadn't realized it. One swore your soul had already left your body, and that what remained was only a vessel for the devil to finish his work. Another said, your cries at night sounded like Latin spoken backwards. No one stayed in your room alone. Marie Anna, now more steward than wife, orchestrated the spiritual pageant. She approved which relics were placed where. She rotated priests like shift workers, in a candlelit factory. She stood watch during exorcisms and offered clipped, efficient instructions to the medics when you collapsed mid-ritual. She no longer bothered pretending she loved you, but she did keep you alive. Barely, mechanically, as if keeping the king breathing was the only way to keep the empire from falling into open chaos. Your face collapsed inward before the rest of your body caught up. The muscles wasted, the skin sagged. Your jaw, once merely grotesque, became ghoulish. Your lips receded, your teeth loosened, your cheeks hollowed so completely that your skull became visible beneath the skin, like death was trying to punch through early. You aged 50 years in the space of a few months. The bones in your hands protruded like claws. Your spine curved inward until you resembled a pile of robes more than a man. Your mind was not spared. You forgot where you were. You forgot who was in the room. You asked if your mother was still alive. You asked for Marie Louise, who had been dead for over a decade. You mistook paintings for windows, windows for doors, and doors for tunnels to hell. You screamed at your reflection. You whispered to pillows. You spent an entire afternoon trying to confess your sins to a potted plant. Your priests responded with silence and more candles. The stench became unbearable. Your body began to rot before it had finished dying. The palace reeked of infection, of unwashed flesh, of the sweet, sour smell of impending death. Servants masked it with lavender, myrrh, and rosewater, but nothing worked. It seeped into the tapestries, into the floors, into the hands of anyone who touched you. Ministers started holding meetings in other wings. Courtiers wore gloves when near you. One foreign ambassador, after being forced to visit your bedside, returned to his estate and burned his clothes. You rallied briefly in October. One day you opened your eyes and asked for music. Another day you asked for figs. People whispered of miracles. The court dared to hope. A bishop suggested that your suffering had reached a divine crescendo and that God might now reward you with renewed strength. But it was just the final flicker of a candle before it dies. The next week, you stopped responding entirely. Your eyes stared without blinking. Your lips moved without sound. Your breath slowed to a shallow whisper. The relics around your bed were doubled. On the night of October 31st, 1700, thunder rolled in over Madrid. Rain lashed the windows of the Alcazar. Your moaning echoed down the halls, raw and wet and wordless. The priests chanted through the storm. The bells were rung for protection. Marie Anna ordered the bed surrounded by candles, as if light could frighten death away. You convulsed once, then twice, then went still. You died just after midnight on November 1st, 1700, aged 38. You looked 90. Your corpse was so wasted, so distorted by illness and time, that the attending physician reportedly wept while pronouncing your death, not from grief, but from sheer relief that your body had finally stopped fighting itself. The prayers stopped. The candles were extinguished. The priests left the room in silence. Your body was opened 2 days after death. It had already begun to decay. The embalmers worked quickly, though not carefully. There was no need for delicacy. You were beyond that. The royal physicians assembled around the table, not for honour, not for medicine, but for the grotesque confirmation of what everyone had long suspected, that you, Charles II of Spain, were less a man and more a tragic experiment in genetic brinkmanship. They had prayed for miracles. What they found was biology in collapse. The first thing they noted was the absence of blood, or at least not enough of it to suggest you had functioned as a living human being in your final weeks. Your body was dry. Your veins collapsed under the blade. The little that remained had thickened into sludge, dark and sluggish, pooling rather than flowing. It was as if your organs had stopped bothering with circulation long before your heart finally gave up. The attending cleric muttered that this was to be expected. The physician said nothing. Your heart, when removed, was barely the size of a walnut. Shrunken, pale and misshapen, it resembled a withered fruit more than a royal organ. It explained much. Your fatigue, your fainting spells, your shallow breathing. The heart that had once sustained the greatest empire in the world could barely have powered a peasant. They recorded the detail in the autopsy notes without irony. Then came your reproductive organs. There wasn't much to observe. One testicle was present. Just one. It was blackened, shriveled, and described in the official report as atrophied beyond function. The other was missing entirely, either never formed or lost at some point to disease or injury. The physicians exchanged glances. It confirmed in one small macabre detail the cause of Spain's dynastic crisis. You had not failed to produce an heir by circumstance. You had failed by design. Your brain, what remained of it, was found to be full of fluid. That was the phrase recorded in the notes. No more specifics, just fluid. They didn't elaborate because there wasn't much else to say. The mass of tissue inside your skull was swollen, soft and mottled. The priests recoiled. One physician crossed himself. Another suggested quietly that perhaps this explained the seizures and the hallucinations and the years of drooling silence. The note stopped short of calling it madness, but only just. The report didn't remain private for long. Within a week, its contents had leaked. Within a month, they were being passed across courts in London, Paris, Vienna, and Rome. They were read aloud at salons. They were quoted in letters. They were studied by scholars and mocked by jesters. The King of Spain had died with one testicle, no blood, a soup-filled skull, and a heart fit for a songbird. The last Habsburg had gone out not in glory, but in anatomical parody. Europe barely paused to mourn. The moment your body cooled, it began to burn. The War of the Spanish Succession ignited less from grief than from opportunity. You had named Philip of Anjou your heir, and the Bourbons wasted no time. Louis XIV proclaimed his grandson King of Spain. The Austrians, incensed, declared the will invalid. England, the Dutch, and the Holy Roman Empire joined forces to prevent France from swallowing another crown. What followed was 13 years of carnage, blockades, sieges, and naval battles, stretching from Flanders to Sicily. Your body was laid to rest beneath marble, but your bones were political kindling. Armies marched over the question of who got to inherit the pieces of your empire. Treaties were shredded, thrones were contested, alliances broke and reformed, cities starved, thousands died. Spain, the once mighty empire, built on gold, conquest, and Catholic fervour, was reduced to a battlefield for the ambitions of men who had only seen it on maps. And as Europe burned, your name entered history, not as a ruler, not as a warrior, not even as a tragic figure, but as a cautionary footnote. You became the definitive example of dynastic inbreeding gone too far. A biological punchline, a human warning label. You were not remembered for your policies because you had none. Not for your victories because you had none. Not even for your failures, because those belonged more to the people around you than to you yourself. You were remembered for your chin, your tongue, your body that refused to function, and your family tree that looped in on itself like a noose. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with you. It had ruled for nearly 2 centuries, over territories from Naples to Mexico, from Peru to the Philippines. It had produced emperors, kings, archdukes, saints and tyrants. But in the end, it produced you. The legacy of Charles V and Philip II collapsed into a man who could not read, could not walk, could not speak without slurring, and could not lift a sword, much less wield one. Marie Anna survived you. She spent the rest of her life insisting you had chosen wisely, that Spain would recover, that your reign had been one of quiet spiritual depth. She preserved the image of a pious, misunderstood monarch, plagued by illness, but beloved by God. No one really believed her, but no one said so to her face. By then, There was no one left who cared to argue. Your death had solved nothing. It had only shifted the burden forward. Spain never recovered its former glory. The Americas slipped away, slowly but inevitably. The navy rotted. The bureaucracy calcified. The empire shrank until it could fit in the shadow of its own past. Madrid became a city of borrowed splendor. The Bourbon kings built new palaces, new statues, new myths. But the memory of the last Habsburg lingered, an open sore beneath the velvet, a name whispered in medical lectures, and diplomatic negotiations with the weight of a curse. Even today, when historians speak of the dangers of royal incest, of dynastic arrogance, of unchecked tradition masquerading as virtue, they do not begin with theory. They begin with you. They begin with Charles II, the bewitched, the doomed, the forgotten. You are a textbook, a case study, a royal corpse pinned to the pages of history, like a specimen in a jar. Your portrait still hangs in museums. People stare at it. Some feel pity. Some feel morbid curiosity. The longer they look, the more they see the sorrow, the strain, the slow collapse carved into the lines of your face. But none of them call you king. Not really. You are a relic, a warning, a memory. And so your dynasty ends, not in a blaze of glory, but in quiet degradation. Spain fades, Europe fractures. And you, Charles II of Spain, last of your line, sink into history, not as a monarch, but as the sad conclusion to a royal experiment that should have ended long before you were born. That brings us to the end of tonight's story, a slow unravelling of bloodlines and bodies, stitched with prayers, soaked in superstition, and embalmed in denial. If you're still listening, thank you for bearing witness to a monarch who was less man than relic, more warning than ruler. History didn't crown him with glory. It handed him a jaw he couldn't close, and an empire he couldn't hold. But now, for a little while, you remembered him. If you'd like early access to more quietly horrifying stories like this one, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the description. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with other forgotten corners of history you'd like to see covered. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps others find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Amanda Lampke. Sleep well.